What is possible for a 23 years old living in Germany? I guess the possibilities are many. It could be college choices, could be global volunteering, even making the decision to take a year gap, travel the world. But if you were in Tunisia 4 years ago, at the age of 23, you would be facing indiscriminate tear gas, police repression, and shooting. Just for the mere fact that you are fighting for your own dignity and freedom, peacefully. But if you wouldn't find yourself in such situation, you would find situation as well. You would find yourself in a worse situation, which is the state, the perpetual state of waithood, which is basically this prolonged and certain state of youth, where seriously, it's not like it's beyond securing a job, but it extends to other aspects of your political and social life. But we decided to question the statehood and confront it. So the revolution in Tunisia started in my graduation year. I was actually sitting for the exams of the first semester. But I decided to go to the streets and challenge what in my country had become George Orwell's 1984 totalitarian regime. Outside of the classroom, we were living in the animal farm, and there were some animals more equal than others. And so, the Tunisian president at the time, Ben Ali, decided to shut down all the schools. You know, one of those dictators' mistakes that should be really written in history. He basically has given us more time to organize and mobilize. So the Tunisian revolution for me is one of those big moments of growth. It's when I realized that the power of the people is more powerful than the people in power. It's when I challenged my concept of individual leadership because it had no leadership. It's when I realized that exercising one freedom is when the streets belong to the people, not the state. And it's when I left the walls of Facebook to tag on the walls of the streets with no fear. It was really this feeling of my very existence as a human being, free and empowered. It was a moment of freedom, but it was also a moment of political consciousness. So we thought that we ousted the dictator and we won a battle against individuals, but we actually had a longer battle against the system because more established and more traditional institutions and political forces occupied the vacuum of our institutions. And so we decided as young people to fight together during the revolution, but after these political forces took over, we found ourselves divided. We struggled to articulate a new common purpose or to define a new political role for ourselves. After ousting the dictator, the elders told us, "You are incompetent to lead." And they hijacked our participation. And all the external factors that usually come with foreign funding from Europe and the US, who have no clue about what we're dreaming for our country, they came in and started building programs for youth political participation. And what they basically did is, thinking the same as our elders, is that we are not ready to lead yet. But nobody realized that refraining from politics was, for many young Tunisians, a conscious political decision. We denounced partisan politics. We just decided and refused to be manipulated by corrupt, self-serving politicians. But we continue to exert our veto right and power on the street. But also, we organize ourselves into lobbying groups and watchdogs. So strengthening civil society instead of running for office has been, for many young Tunisians, a conscious political decision. Voting blank in the last elections has been a conscious political decision. So growing with the revolution reduced our burden of the state of waithood through civic engagement and political consciousness, even though it didn't really solve fundamental issues like unemployment, exclusion, and disillusion. But it at least created those, new frameworks to establish new spaces where we can organize and we can influence decision-making. So I would like to project this youth state in a broader picture. I'm sure you have heard about the revolution in Tunisia inspiring movements around the world, and Occupy movement and all the protests happening in the world. But maybe countries you will look at would be Ukraine, the US, Turkey. I was looking instead into thousands of people protesting in the streets of Africa. A story that the mainstream media, the Western media, wouldn't really report until it becomes a violent conflict. I was looking into countries like Senegal. In June 2011, just 6 months after our revolution began, Senegalese youth came out to the streets and protested in a rallying of a movement called Y'en a marre, enough is enough. And they basically managed to stop a constitutional amendment introduced by their president at the time, Abdoulaye Wade. What Wade did is that he introduced a law where he allowed presidential candidates to win the election with only 25% of the vote. And so young Senegalese came out to the streets with their placards, "Ma carte d'électeur, mon arme," my voting card, my power, my weapon. And they succeeded to remove him from power in February 2012, and he handed power peacefully to Macky Sall. Not very far from Dakar, in West Africa, in Burkina Faso. That was really huge demonstration on 28 October 2014. Thousands and thousands of people went to the central square of Ouagadougou, protesting their president, what they call a constitutional coup. Their president, Blaise, what he did is that he introduced a law again that will allow him to run for re-election after being in power for more than a quarter of a century. Dictators. And so, young people in Burkina were holding and chanting, "Blaise dégage." It was exactly the same slogan we used in Tunisia, "Ben Ali dégage," which basically means get out. So these movements around these capitals and many others, Togo, Burundi, Angola, Occupy South Africa, Rwanda, Uganda, I don't really understand why they call it the Arab Spring, because if you look at all the movements in Africa, it's far more than the movements happen in the Middle East. But again, a Western narrative. And so when I visited Senegal, I was so overwhelmed with the energy of young people there. They were telling me proudly about how they organize their movements. And my friends in Burkina last year were Facebooking me, yeah, it's happening, one solution, revolution. And it's like, I felt so connected to these movements and shared struggles that I ended up traveling to over 20 African countries, meeting youth movements and young people. And I realized a couple of things. Very funny picture. The first one, I realized that even if we ousted all the dictators from the continent, it will not solve the problem, because we don't have an alternative. The leadership is inherently corrupt and dictatorial. And I realized the power of the post-colonials, which is, if we fight systems in Africa, is not just fighting our own systems and our own governments, it's really fighting the structures of the world system that made Africa today. As the West continue to control African governments, states, and politics, as the West continue to control our human and material resources and continue the nourishment of Western industries with Africa's markets and production. And so I realized more and more when I talked to young people all over the continent that actually African youth are not a lost generation, apathetic about our situation. They are very aware and very conscious about the state of marginalization. And we are all very sick of our government's inability and unwilling to solve our problems. And so I had this vision that we should take this shared marginalization as a positive thing, not a negative thing, and develop out of it a common identity. Let's share the struggles and draw solutions from it. Let's bridge the struggles from North Africa to the rest of the continent. And this is how the African Youth Movement was born. It's basically a movement that brings young African leaders and visionaries together who are really involved in day-to-day progress of the continent. Inspired by the revolution and acknowledging that many young Africans like myself have been trapped in this state of waithood, the African Youth Movement is the space where we share ideas and we fully participate in the decision-making and we implement our projects across the continent. And so we basically organized ourselves in different committees, from gender equality to environment to sustainable development to governance. And we're trying through these committees to open debates and conversations and critically think about possible solutions and present them to our leaders, or our dictators, I shall say. And so far we have 40 young leaders from 26 countries leading these committees. And we have hundreds of African youth, not only in Africa, but in the diaspora, supporting the movement. And what we are really trying to claim is that we are not the leaders of tomorrow. You, the elders, keep telling us, you are the leaders of tomorrow. We are the leaders of today. We are already leading movements, ousting dictators, leading social change. And we want to prove that. Even though we do not have the luxury and privilege of 23 years old living in Germany, having many possibilities of life and success, what we have is our life full of constant growth. Like the African proverb says, where you sit when you are old shows where you stood in your youth. Thank you.